Survival, in corporate America, rarely favors the brave. It rewards those who keep their heads down, do the work, and clock out to be with the people who matter. Tom, a single dad, scraping by paycheck to paycheck, understood this implicitly. He spent every day toiling under the thumb of a billionaire CEO who didn't even know he existed. Yet, upon finding that very same executive unconscious on the curb, Tom shattered his golden rule of self-preservation. He made the mistake of caring. The alarm went off at 5 a.m. It always did. Tom reached blindly through the dark, his hand slamming onto the snooze button with the practiced accuracy of a man who had done this 1,000 times. He lay there for exactly 60 seconds, staring at the water stain on the ceiling. It looked vaguely like a skull, or maybe just a warning. He rolled out of bed. The floorboards were cold. He stepped over a stray plastic dinosaur, a stegosaurus specifically, and nudged his son's bedroom door open. 6-year-old Keo was sprawled sideways across his mattress, one leg hanging off the edge, breathing the deep, untroubled rhythm of a kid who knew his dad would handle everything. Tom smiled. It was a tired smile, heavy at the edges. But it was real. By 7:30 a.m., Tom was another gray suit in a sea of gray suits, scanning his badge at the security turnstiles of Croft Enterprises. The building was a towering monument to glass, steel, and ruthless efficiency. It smelled like ozone and expensive floor wax. He spent his days on the 14th floor, a mid-level financial analyst buried under spreadsheets. His job was to track the shifting decimal points of Valerie Croft's expanding empire. It was a sterile landscape of data. But Tom knew what the numbers meant. A decimal point moving to the left meant a branch closed in Ohio. It meant 200 people lost their health care. It meant fathers like him explaining to their kids why Christmas was going to be a little light this year. Valerie Croft was the architect of it all. She was 32, inherited the company at 25, and doubled its market cap by 30. She didn't walk through the office. She cut through it. When she stepped out of her private elevator, the ambient volume of the floor dropped to a whisper. She was sharp edges and cold calculation, usually dressed in tailored charcoal or black, her expression permanently locked into a mask of polite disdain. Tom had worked there for 4 years. She had never once looked him in the eye. To her, he wasn't a person. He was overhead. The annual winter gala was mandatory. The email from HR had used the word highly encouraged, which in corporate speak meant show up or pack your desk. It was held in a rented ballroom at the Fairmont. Ice sculptures of the company logo melted slowly into silver drip pans. Waiters circulated with champagne flutes that cost more than Tom's weekly grocery budget. Tom stood near a massive marble pillar near the coat check, clutching a lukewarm club soda, periodically checking his watch. He was paying Mrs. Higgins $20 an hour to watch Keo. He calculated he could leave by 10:30 p.m. without drawing attention. At 10:15 p.m., he saw her. Valerie Croft was leaning heavily against the mahogany bar at the far side of the room. She was wearing a midnight blue evening gown that clung to her like a second skin. But her posture was entirely wrong. The rigid, terrifying CEO was gone. She was swaying. Tom watched as a bartender handed her a lowball glass filled with amber liquid. She didn't sip it. She threw it back like it was water, slammed the glass down, and gestured for another. Tom frowned. It was common knowledge that Valerie Croft didn't drink in public. She never yielded an inch of control. But tonight, her eyes were glazed, her hair was slightly undone, and she was gripping the edge of the bar so hard her knuckles were bone white. 2 executives from acquisitions approached her, smiling slick, predatory smiles. Valerie snapped something at them. Even from across the room, Tom saw the executives recoil. She shoved away from the bar, nearly tripping over the hem of her dress. She didn't head for the main exit, where her driver would be waiting. She pushed through a set of heavy fire doors leading out to the service alley. Tom looked at his watch. 10:20 p.m. He could leave. He should leave. But he thought about the weather outside. It was December in Seattle. The rain was coming down in freezing horizontal sheets. He thought about a woman in a sleeveless dress wandering into an alley known for aggressive junkies and shattered glass. He set his club soda down on a passing tray, cursing under his breath. He pushed through the fire doors. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The alley was dark, illuminated only by the sickly orange glow of a sodium street lamp. The rain deafened the city noise. Valerie was sitting on an overturned milk crate next to a humming industrial dumpster. Her knees were pulled up to her chest. Her phone was on the wet asphalt, the screen shattered. Tom kept his distance, treating the situation like he had stumbled upon a wounded predator. "Ms. Croft," he called out, raising his voice over the rain. She jerked her head up. Her mascara was running, cutting black rivers through the expensive foundation on her cheeks. She squinted at him. "Who the hell are you?" Her words were thick, stumbling into each other. "Tom Harris, financial analysis, floor 14. He took a slow step forward, taking off his suit jacket. "You're freezing. Let's get you back inside. I can find your driver." "No driver," she slurred, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. She shivered violently. "Fired him. Fired everyone today. Board meeting. Bastards tried to vote me out of my own father's company. I showed them." She let out a laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "I showed them." Tom stopped. So that was it. A corporate coup. She had survived it, but the adrenaline had crashed, leaving her here, self-medicating in the dark. "Okay," Tom said evenly. He held out his jacket. "Put this on. Let's get you a cab." Valerie stared at the jacket like it was a trap. Then, another violent shiver racked her thin frame. She snatched it from his hands, burying herself in the oversized gray wool. "I'll call HR," she muttered, trying to stand and immediately failing, her ankle rolling in her stiletto. She fell back onto the crate. "I'll have you fired for looking at me." "Noted," Tom said, utterly devoid of emotion. He pulled his own phone from his pocket. He didn't care about her threats. He cared about the fact that her lips were turning blue. "I'm calling a taxi." The inside of the yellow cab smelled intensely of pine air freshener and old cigarette smoke. It was a sensory nightmare, but it was warm. Valerie was slumped against the passenger door. Tom's jacket swallowed her up. Her eyes were closed, her breathing heavy and erratic. Tom sat as far away from her as the cramped back seat allowed. His internal monologue was a chaotic loop of worst-case scenarios. If she woke up confused, she could accuse him of kidnapping. If someone snapped a photo of them leaving together, the office rumor mill would end his career by 9 a.m. tomorrow. "Where to, buddy?" the driver asked, eyeing them through the rearview mirror. Tom looked at Valerie. "Miss Croft, I need your address." She groaned, her head rolling against the smudged window. "Mercer Island, the Point." She mumbled a gate code before drifting off again. Tom relayed the information to the driver. The cab lurched forward into the slick, rain-swept streets. The drive took 30 minutes. The entire time, Tom stared out the window, watching the neon signs bleed into the wet pavement. He thought about Keo. He texted Mrs. Higgins, promising her an extra $50 for keeping him late. He checked his bank account app on his phone. The balance was $140.50. The taxi fare was going to eat half of that. He felt a familiar, grinding knot in his stomach. "We're here," the driver announced, slamming on the brakes. Tom looked out. They were parked in front of a massive wrought iron gate. Beyond it, a sprawling, modern mansion sat on a cliff overlooking the dark waters of Lake Washington. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. "Ms. Croft," Tom said, gently tapping her shoulder. "We're here. You need to open the gate." Nothing. She was completely unresponsive. Tom sighed. He unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned over, rummaging through the small clutch purse she had brought. A tube of lipstick, a platinum credit card. No keys, no key card. "She doesn't have her keys," Tom told the driver. "Not my problem, man. Meters at $85. You want me to leave you on the curb?" Tom looked at the freezing rain lashing against the windshield. He looked at the unconscious woman beside him. He could prop her up against the gate, pay the man, and leave. It was the smart thing to do. She was a billionaire. She would figure it out. She was the woman who had laid off his friend Dave last month, just to make a quarterly earnings report. Look 3% better. Tom squeezed his eyes shut. "Don't be a hero. Go home." He looked at her again. Beneath the smeared makeup and the ruthless reputation, she was just a person. A severely intoxicated, freezing, vulnerable person. If he left her out here in the storm, she could get hypothermia. She could die. "Turn around," Tom said, his voice heavy with resignation. "What?" "Turn around. Take us to Capitol Hill, 14th and Pike." The driver shrugged. "Your funeral, buddy." An hour later, the taxi pulled up to a faded brick apartment building. Tom paid the driver, wincing as he handed over nearly all the cash he had. He stepped out into the rain, opened the passenger door, and caught Valerie as she practically tumbled out. She was dead weight. Getting her up 3 flights of stairs was a grueling, agonizing process. Tom had to practically carry her, his arm wrapped tight around her waist, her arm draped over his shoulder. She mumbled incoherently, something about stock options and her father, before her chin hit her chest again. He managed to unlock his door with one hand. He kicked it open and dragged her inside. The apartment was small. The living room doubled as a dining room and a playroom. Toys were scattered across a faded rug. A small television sat on a cheap particle board stand. The air smelled faintly of macaroni and cheese. Mrs. Higgins, a plump woman in her 60s, stood up from the armchair, her eyes widening in alarm. "Tom, good heavens, who is that?" "My boss," Tom panted, hauling Valerie toward the thrift store sofa. He deposited her onto the cushions. She immediately curled into a tight ball, shivering. She had a rough night. Her driver left her and she was locked out of her house. Mrs. Higgins pursed her lips, clearly not buying the sanitized version of the story, but she nodded. "Keo is asleep." He brushed his teeth. "Do you need me to stay?" "No, I've got it." "Thank you, Martha. I'm sorry it's so late." Tom handed her the cash. Once the door clicked shut behind the babysitter, the apartment fell silent save for the rhythmic drumming of rain against the single window and the soft, uneven breathing of the billionaire on his couch. Tom didn't touch her. He didn't try to take off her ruined heels. He went to the kitchen, grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the hall closet, and tossed it over her. He placed a glass of water and 2 ibuprofen tablets on the coffee table beside her head. Then he went to Keo's room. He stood in the doorway for a long time, watching his son sleep, letting the steady rise and fall of the boy's chest quiet the roaring anxiety in his own head. Tom didn't sleep in his bed that night. He pulled a hard-back dining chair into the corner of the living room, sat down, and kept watch. The smell woke her. It wasn't the scent of imported linen or the lavender diffusers her housekeeper used. It was the sharp, bitter smell of cheap coffee and slightly burnt toast. Valerie groaned, pressing the heels of her hands into her eyes. Her head felt like it had been split open with a rusted axe. Her mouth tasted like ash and regret. She tried to shift, but the surface beneath her was lumpy and unforgiving. Slowly, agonizingly, she opened her eyes. She was staring at a wall covered in crayon drawings, stick figures holding hands under a violently yellow sun. A misshapen dog. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her hangover. She sat up too fast, the room spinning wildly. She grabbed the edge of the sofa to steady herself. "Easy!" The voice came from her left. Valerie whipped her head around, her defensive instincts flaring. Tom was standing in a tiny kitchen area, separated from the living room by a narrow counter. He was wearing faded jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. He didn't look like a corporate drone. He looked tired, rugged, and entirely unimpressed. "Drink the water. Take the pills," Tom said, pointing a spatula at the coffee table. "Then we'll talk." Valerie looked down. The glass and the white tablets were waiting for her. She reached out with a trembling hand, swallowed the pills dry, and chased them with the water. She looked down at herself. She was still wearing her $4,000 gown, though it was wrinkled beyond repair. She was wrapped in a scratchy blanket. She still had her purse. "Where am I?" she demanded, trying to inject her usual authority into her voice. It came out as a raspy croak. "Who are you?" "Tom Harris. We met in the alley last night. You're in my apartment on Capitol Hill." Tom flipped a pancake on a small skillet. "You were locked out of your estate. Your phone was broken. You passed out in the cab. I couldn't leave you in the rain, and I couldn't leave you on your porch." Valerie's mind raced, struggling to piece together the shattered fragments of the previous night. The gala, the scotch, the crushing weight of the board's betrayal. The alley. She looked around the room. It was painfully small. Worn furniture, scuffed floorboards, a stack of unpaid bills sitting under a plastic dinosaur on the kitchen counter. This was how her employees lived. The realization made her deeply uncomfortable. "If this is a shakedown," Valerie said, her voice hardening, "if you took photos of me, or if you plan on going to the press, my lawyers will bury you so deep you won't see daylight for a decade." Tom didn't even blink. He slid the pancake onto a plate. "I make $65,000 a year, Miss Croft. I don't have the time or the energy to blackmail you. I brought you here because I didn't want you to freeze to death. That's it." Before Valerie could respond, a door down the short hallway creaked open. A small boy, wearing mismatched pajamas and rubbing his eyes, padded into the living room. His hair was a chaotic nest of brown curls. He stopped when he saw Valerie on the couch. "Dad?" the boy asked, his voice thick with sleep. "Who is that?" "That's Ms. Croft, buddy," Tom said, his entire demeanor shifting. The hard, cynical edge vanished, replaced by a deep, resonant warmth. He walked out from behind the counter, kneeling to eye level with the boy. "She's a guest. She wasn't feeling well last night." Keo looked at Valerie. Valerie froze, terrified of children. She didn't know how to speak to them. They didn't understand leverage or ROI. Keo walked over to the coffee table. He reached into the pocket of his pajama pants and pulled out a small blue plastic triceratops. He held it out toward her. "You can hold it," Keo said seriously. "He protects me from monsters." Valerie stared at the toy. She looked at the boy's earnest face. Then she looked at Tom, who was watching her with a quiet, guarded intensity. Slowly, she reached out and took the plastic dinosaur. Her hand was shaking. "Thank you," she whispered. "Pancakes are ready, Keo," Tom said, breaking the tension. "Go eat. I'll get Miss Croft a cup of coffee." Keo scampered to the counter, clambering onto a stool. Tom poured black coffee into a chipped mug that read, "World's okayest dad," and walked it over to Valerie. She took it, wrapping both hands around the hot ceramic. She watched Tom. She watched him wipe syrup off the counter, ruffle his son's hair, and check his watch. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of Keo chewing and the distant hum of traffic outside. Valerie looked at the peeling paint on the windowsill. She thought about the layout of this apartment. She knew the property values in this neighborhood. She knew exactly what Tom took home every 2 weeks, down to the penny. She looked at Tom, who was now putting a carton of milk back in the fridge. You knew exactly who I was, Valerie said quietly. Tom closed the fridge door. I did. I signed off on the restructuring last quarter, she continued, her voice gaining a strange, brittle clarity. I fired your colleagues. I cut the overtime budget for your department. I know your name now, Tom. I know what tier you are. I know you're struggling. Tom crossed his arms, leaning against the counter. Is there a point to this, Ms. Croft? Yes, Valerie said. She placed the mug on the table. The defensive armor was gone. She wasn't the CEO right now. She was just a woman sitting on a cheap couch, staring at a reality she had engineered but never witnessed. You hate me, she stated. It wasn't a question. You have every right to hate me. You could have left me in that alley. You could have dropped me at my gate and let the elements take care of your problem. Why didn't you? Tom looked at her, then glanced at Keo, who was blissfully oblivious, building a syrup lake on his plate. Because my son is watching, Tom said simply. His voice was low, devoid of anger, just heavy with undeniable truth. I can't teach him how to be a decent man in a broken world if I leave broken people on the sidewalk. The words hit Valerie like a physical strike. Broken people. She had $3 billion in assets, a private jet, and a board of directors that feared her. But sitting in this cramped, messy, love-filled room, she had never felt so utterly, completely bankrupt. She looked at the plastic dinosaur in her hand. Then she looked back at Tom. The silence this time was heavier, charged with something new. The cynical distance between the billionaire and the employee was collapsing, crushed under the weight of a single devastating realization. She swallowed hard, fighting the sudden, terrifying sting of tears behind her eyes. Tom, she asked, her voice barely a whisper, stripping away every ounce of her pride. How do you do it? Tom frowned, confused. Do what? Valerie gestured vaguely around the tiny room, at the worn rug, at the boy laughing quietly at a cartoon playing on a cracked phone screen, at the sheer undeniable reality of it all. How do you build a life that actually matters? She asked. Because I have everything, and I have absolutely nothing. Tom stood motionless, realizing in that exact second that he wasn't looking at a CEO anymore. He was looking at a woman drowning in her own success, asking him for a lifeline. Then let me teach you, he said. And in that small, messy apartment, everything changed. Valerie left Tom's apartment an hour later in a black SUV that cost more than the entire building she was stepping out of. She didn't say much when the new driver held the door open for her. She just clutched her ruined evening gown beneath a heavy trench coat. She'd had a terrified assistant run over from her penthouse. She watched Tom from the tinted window. He was standing on the curb in the freezing drizzle, holding his son's hand. He didn't wave. He just watched the car pull away, turned around, and walked back into the grimy brick building. For the next 48 hours, Valerie Croft existed in a state of suspended animation. She went through the motions. She drank green juice she couldn't taste, sat through conference calls she didn't hear, and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Mercer Island estate, looking at a city she owned pieces of but didn't actually know. Monday morning arrived with the subtlety of a freight train. On the 14th floor, Tom sat at his cubicle, aggressively typing numbers into a cell that didn't matter. His stomach was a tight knot of dread. He had spent Sunday updating his resume. You didn't see the Wizard of Oz puking in a gutter and get to keep your job in Emerald City. It was a basic rule of corporate physics. At 10:14 a.m., his desk phone rang. It was the sterile double chirp of an internal call. Harris, Tom answered, keeping his voice flat. Mr. Harris, this is Sarah, executive assistant to Ms. Croft. You are requested on the 40th floor. Immediately. The line went dead. Tom stared at the receiver. He slowly placed it back on the cradle. Dave, the analyst in the adjacent cubicle, peeked his head over the gray fabric partition. 40th floor? Man, what did you do? I don't know, Tom lied. He stood up, grabbed his security badge, and walked toward the elevators. It felt like walking to the gallows. The 40th floor was a different world. The air was thinner up here. The carpet was impossibly thick, swallowing the sound of footsteps. Modern art that looked like spilled paint and rusty wire hung on imported wood-paneled walls. Sarah, a woman whose posture suggested she was ready to catch a bullet for her boss, buzzed Tom through a set of frosted glass doors. Valerie's office was massive, dominated by a desk carved from a single slab of reclaimed walnut. She was standing by the window wearing a razor-sharp white blazer and black trousers. Her hair was pulled back into a severe knot. The vulnerable woman shivering under a cheap wool blanket on his couch was gone. The iron heel was back. "Shut the door, Tom," she said without turning around. Tom pushed the heavy oak door until it clicked. He stood his ground near the entrance, hands in his pockets. "If this is about severance, I want it in writing." Valerie turned. Her eyes were clear, calculating, but there was a faint tightness around her jaw. She walked over to her desk and tapped a leather-bound folder. "I looked into your file this morning," Valerie said, her voice entirely devoid of warmth. "You've been here 4 years. Your performance reviews are perfectly average. You never volunteer for extra projects. You clock out at exactly 5:00 p.m. You are the textbook definition of a placeholder." Tom clenched his jaw. "I do the job I'm paid for. I don't live for the company. I live for my kid. If that's a fireable offense, go ahead and print the paperwork." Valerie didn't blink. "I don't want to fire you. I want to promote you." Tom laughed. It was a harsh, cynical sound. "Right. To what? Chief Apology Officer?" "Special Liaison to the CEO," Valerie said, sliding the folder across the desk. "Effective immediately. You'll be moved to an office on this floor. Your salary will be tripled. You will report directly and only to me." Tom didn't step forward to take the folder. He just stared at her. "Why?" "Because," Valerie said, her voice dropping an octave, losing some of its corporate polish. "Every single person on this floor is a yes man. They feed me data that's been sanitized, homogenized, and stripped of anything remotely human. They tell me what I want to hear so they can keep their bonuses." She leaned forward, resting her palms on the walnut desk. "You don't care about my money. You don't care about my title. You told me I was broken to my face." "I didn't say that." "You implied it, and you were right." Valerie stood up straight. "You told me you could teach me how to build a life that matters. Put your money where your mouth is. Show me what I'm breaking." Tom looked at the folder. A tripled salary meant Mrs. Higgins could get a raise. It meant Keogh's college fund wouldn't be an empty savings account. It meant a reliable car that didn't stall at red lights. But it also meant getting closer to the blast radius of a woman who destroyed lives for a living. "I clock out at 5, Tom said, his voice hard. "No exceptions. And if I tell you a policy is garbage, I'm not going to sugarcoat it." "I wouldn't expect you to," Valerie said. "Sit down, Tom. We have a lot of work to do." By week 3, Tom realized he hadn't been promoted. He had been drafted into a war. Working with Valerie Croft was like trying to redirect a river with a teaspoon. She was brilliant, relentless, and completely detached from the physical reality of her decisions. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The sky outside the 40th floor windows was the color of a bruised plum. Tom slammed a thick manila folder onto the center of Valerie's immaculate desk. "What is this?" Valerie asked, glancing up from her monitor. "That's the Q3 logistics report," Tom said, leaning over the desk. "Specifically the fulfillment center in Detroit. You signed off on a 20% reduction in utility overheads last month." "I did," Valerie said defensively. The margins were bleeding. The facility is fully automated. We don't need to heat it like a resort. It's not fully automated, Valerie. Tom shot back. He had dropped the Ms. Croft a week ago, when they spent 4 hours screaming at each other over a healthcare restructuring plan. You have 60 people on the floor managing the sorting belts. The temperature in Detroit hit 12 degrees yesterday. The warehouse is sitting at 45 degrees because of your cap. People are wearing winter coats on forklifts. A guy named Marcus broke his collarbone because the steering column froze up. Valerie stared at him. She looked down at the folder. She didn't open it. The board demanded a 4% reduction in operating costs across the logistics division. I don't care about the board, Tom said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. I care about the fact that you saved $40,000 by giving your own employees mild hypothermia. Look at the file. Valerie hesitated. Her hand hovered over the manila cover. She flipped it open. Tom hadn't included spreadsheets. He had pulled the internal HR incident reports. There were photos, blurry, poorly lit pictures taken by a shift manager. Marcus, sitting on a concrete floor, his arm hanging at a sickening angle, his breath pluming in the freezing air of the warehouse. Valerie stared at the photograph for a long, agonizing minute. The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the HVAC system. I didn't know, she whispered. You didn't want to know, Tom corrected gently. That's the difference. You look at numbers. Numbers don't bleed. Numbers don't have to explain to their wives why they're in the emergency room on a Tuesday. Valerie closed the folder. She looked sick. She picked up her desk phone and hit a speed dial button. Sarah, reverse the utility caps on all northern fulfillment centers. Yes, all of them. Retroactive to yesterday. Tell maintenance to crank the heat, and get me the phone number for a Marcus. She looked at Tom. Miller, Tom supplied. Marcus Miller, Detroit facility. Get him on my line in 10 minutes. She hung up. She didn't look at Tom for a long time. When she finally did, her eyes were red. Next file. The shift was agonizingly slow, but it was happening. Tom forced her to look at the collateral damage of every decree she issued. He dragged her out of the stratosphere and rubbed her face in the dirt of reality. It culminated 2 weeks later. It was 6:30 p.m. on a Friday. Tom had broken his own rule. He was still at the office. Mrs. Higgins had a family emergency, and Tom had no choice but to bring Keo into the fortress. Keo was sitting on the floor of Valerie's office, surrounded by a small army of plastic dinosaurs using a stack of $250,000 acquisition proposals as a terrain feature. Valerie and Tom were sitting on the couch near the corner of the office, surrounded by empty takeout boxes of Thai food. Valerie was staring at a complex financial model on her laptop, but her eyes kept drifting down to the 6-year-old boy on the carpet. Does he always make those sound effects? Valerie asked quietly, watching Keo orchestrate a brutal, slow-motion battle between a T-Rex and a stapler. Only when the stakes are high, Tom said, taking a bite of cold pad Thai. The stapler represents corporate greed. The T-Rex is the working class. Valerie let out a genuine, startled laugh. It was a good sound. It made her look 10 years younger, erasing the severe lines around her mouth. She set her laptop aside and slid off the leather couch, sitting cross-legged on the thick carpet next to Keo. Tom watched, slightly stunned. She was wearing a $1,000 silk blouse, and she was sitting on the floor. What's happening here? Valerie asked the boy. Keo didn't miss a beat. The metal monster took the watering hole. Rex is hungry. Valerie picked up a plastic brachiosaurus. Can this one help? Keo looked at her, then at the dinosaur, assessing her tactical choice. Yeah, he's got a long neck he can see over the mountain. He pointed to a stack of manila folders. For the next 20 minutes, Tom just watched. He watched the billionaire CEO of Croft Enterprises negotiate a peace treaty between a fleet of plastic dinosaurs and office supplies. He watched her smile, not the predatory smirk she gave investors, but a soft, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. He felt a sudden, terrifying shift in his chest. He had spent 4 years hating this woman. Now watching her build a wall out of highlighters with his son, he realized he didn't hate her at all. He realized something far more dangerous. He was starting to care about her. Valerie looked up, catching his eye. The office was quiet. The city lights of Seattle glittered through the glass behind them. In that moment, the corporate hierarchy didn't exist. There was just a man, a woman, and a kid in a room. "I'm terminating the automated customer service AI project," Valerie said softly, not breaking eye contact with Tom. Tom froze. "That project is projected to save $30 million over 2 years. It's also going to cost 400 people their jobs just before Christmas," Valerie said. She placed the Brachiosaurus down gently. "The margins are tight, but we can absorb the cost if we pause the executive dividend payout for Q4. Tom stared at her. "The board is going to slaughter you." "Let them try," Valerie said, her jaw setting into that familiar iron line. But this time, she wasn't fighting for power. She was fighting for something else. "I'm done building an empire out of ghosts." Tom swallowed hard. He nodded once. "Okay, I'll run the numbers on Monday." They both knew it was going to be a bloodbath. They just didn't know who was going to bleed first. The backlash didn't take weeks. It took exactly 4 days. Richard Vance, the chairman of the board, was a man who viewed empathy as a terminal disease. He had been Valerie's father's right-hand man, a relic of the old guard who believed human capital was meant to be burned for fuel. Tom was sitting in his office, a glass box adjoining Valerie's suite, when he saw Richard marching through the frosted double doors. Richard was flanked by 2 other board members. They didn't look like they were here to negotiate. They looked like an execution squad. Tom stood up, walking out of his office, just as Richard bypassed Sarah's desk entirely, and threw open the door to Valerie's inner sanctum. Tom slipped in behind them, shutting the door. Valerie was standing by the window. She didn't flinch. "Richard," Valerie said coldly, "you don't have an appointment." "I don't need an appointment to stop you from burning this company to the ground," Richard snapped. He threw a thick, leather-bound portfolio onto her desk. The slap of leather on wood echoed like a gunshot. "What is this, Valerie?" "You canceled the AI rollout. You reinstated full benefits for part-time warehouse staff. You froze the executive dividends. Our stock dipped 1.5 points this morning." "The stock will recover," Valerie said smoothly, walking around to face them. "The long-term retention of a healthy workforce reduces hiring churn by—" "Don't quote HR statistics at me," Richard roared, his face flushing violently red. "You are running a charity, not a Fortune 500 company. The board had an emergency session this morning. You are acting erratically. You're making emotional decisions, and we know exactly where it's coming from." Richard turned his gaze on Tom. The older man's eyes were filled with absolute venom. "Tom Harris," Richard sneered, mid-level analyst plucked from obscurity, suddenly playing whisperer to the CEO. "You think we don't do our homework? We know you took her to your apartment after the gala. We know you've been entirely responsible for these sudden, philanthropic urges." Valerie stepped forward, her voice cracking like a whip. "Leave him out of this, Richard. My decisions are my own." "Not anymore," Richard said. He pulled a single sheet of paper from the inside pocket of his tailored suit. He handed it to Tom. Tom took it. It had the official HR watermark, termination of employment, effective immediately, cause violation of corporate code of conduct, exercising inappropriate leverage and personal influence over executive management. Tom felt the air leave his lungs. It wasn't the loss of the job that hit him. It was the sudden, violent reminder of his own fragility. He had a mortgage, he had a kid, he had nothing to fall back on. He was a peasant playing a king's game, and the kings had just remembered he was on the board. "You can't do this," Valerie said, her voice shaking with a rage Tom had never seen before. "I am the CEO. I have final approval on all executive hires. Read the bylaws, Valerie." Richard smiled, a thin, cruel slash of a smile. In the event of a formal board investigation regarding executive coercion, the board retains the right to isolate the variable. He's fired. Security is waiting at his desk on the 14th floor to pack his personal items. Richard turned back to Valerie. "You have 48 hours to reverse your recent policy changes. If you don't, we will initiate a vote of no confidence. We will strip you of your title, take the company public, and sell it for parts. Your father would be ashamed of you." Richard buttoned his jacket and walked out, his cronies following close behind. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing the silence in the room. Valerie stood frozen. She looked at the door, then slowly turned to look at Tom. Tom was staring at the termination letter. His hands were shaking. All the warmth, all the progress, all the human connection they had built over the last month evaporated in the sterile, air-conditioned chill of the office. "Tom," Valerie started, her voice fracturing. She took a step toward him. "I'll fix this. I'll call the legal team. I'll tie them up in injunctions. They can't—" "Stop," Tom said. His voice was a harsh whisper. He stepped back, putting distance between them. "Tom, please, just give me a day." Tom looked up. His eyes were utterly defeated. "I told you, Valerie. I told you I didn't want to play this game. I told you I just wanted to do my job and go home to my kid. You pulled me up here. You made me believe you actually gave a damn." "I do," Valerie pleaded, the tears she never let fall finally spilling over her lashes. "You changed everything, Tom. You made me see." "You see nothing!" Tom exploded, slamming the paper onto her desk. "You see a game. You see a boardroom battle. You can afford to lose this fight, Valerie. If you get fired, you fall back into a golden parachute. You go to a beach in Monaco. If I lose this job, my son goes hungry. We lose our home. You played with my life to soothe your own conscience." Valerie recoiled as if he had struck her physically. The color drained from her face. "That's not fair. I was trying to do the right thing." "The right thing for who?" Tom grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. The anger was fading, replaced by a crushing, leaden reality. He looked at the woman he had begun to care for, the woman who had sat on his floor and played with his kid, and he saw the billionaire again. The gap between them was an ocean, and he was drowning in it. "I can't afford to be your moral compass, Valerie," Tom said quietly, his hand on the doorknob. "I have to be a father." He didn't wait for her to answer. He opened the door and walked out, leaving the CEO of Croft Enterprises entirely alone in her glass tower. The box was surprisingly light. 4 years of a man's life, reduced to a plastic terrarium. 3 framed photos, a coffee mug, and a handful of customized pens. Tom carried it out the revolving glass doors of Croft Enterprises. The security guard, a guy named Stan, who usually traded baseball stats with Tom every morning, wouldn't even meet his eyes. Stan just stared at the polished granite floor as Tom walked past. Survival instinct. Contagion protocol. It was raining again. The Seattle sky was a relentless, bruised gray. Tom didn't take a taxi. He couldn't afford one. He walked the 8 blocks to the bus stop, the cardboard box growing heavy, the bottom turning soft and pulpy from the drizzle. The first week was a masterclass in denial. Tom treated job hunting like a 9-to-5 shift. He sat at the tiny laminate kitchen table, laptop open, cycling through job boards with ruthless efficiency. He sent out 40 applications. He tailored his cover letters. He called old college roommates who had moved on to mid-level management at rival firms. Sorry, Tommy, they would say, their voices thick with uncomfortable pity. There's a hiring freeze. Or, word travels fast, man. You got publicly marched out by Richard's faction. Nobody wants to touch that right now. Corporate America was a small town, and Tom had been labeled a leper. By week 2, the denial curdled into panic. The severance package was tied up in legal review. A final petty twist of the knife from the board. His savings account, already anemic, was draining with terrifying speed. Rent, groceries, the electric bill, Mrs. Higgins's weekly pay. It was a math equation that only had one ending, and Tom was staring right at it. He started lying to Keogh. It was the hardest part. "Why are you home so much, Dad?" Keogh asked on a Tuesday afternoon, pushing a yellow plastic dump truck across the worn rug. Tom looked up from his laptop. The screen displayed a rejection email from a logistics firm in Bellevue. "Taking some vacation days, buddy. Thought we could hang out more." Keogh beamed, entirely satisfied with the answer. "Can we go to the zoo?" Tom felt a physical ache in his chest. The zoo meant gas money. It meant a $20 admission ticket. It meant a $10 hot dog. "Not today, pal." Tom forced a smile. "Let's build a fort instead. The couch cushions are looking prime for a castle." They built the fort. Tom sat inside the dark, fabric-smelling tent, listening to his son narrate a battle between knights and dragons. He closed his eyes. The fear was a living thing in his stomach, chewing at the lining. He had played the hero. He had tried to show a billionaire the human cost of her empire, and the reward was exactly what he had always known it would be: the absolute destruction of his own small world. He didn't hear from Valerie. He didn't expect to. The news was full of Croft Enterprises. The financial channels were running wall-to-wall coverage of the internal bloodbath. Richard and his loyalists had launched a hostile proxy fight. They were rallying institutional investors, leaking stories to the press about Valerie's erratic behavior and emotional instability. Tom watched it on the muted television while Keogh slept. Valerie looked different in the press conference clips. The tailored suits were there, the immaculate hair was there, but the mask had cracked. She looked exhausted. She looked like a woman fighting a war on two fronts. He turned the television off. It wasn't his fight anymore. He had an interview for a night manager position at a grocery store the next morning. It paid a third of his old salary, but it was money. He went to the kitchen and opened the fridge. A half-gallon of milk, a block of cheap cheddar, 2 apples. He stared at the sparse shelves. The cynic in him, the voice he had silenced for a month, screamed in his ear. "This is what happens! You look up, you get your throat cut!" He shut the fridge door. He leaned his forehead against the cool metal. For the first time since Keogh's mother had walked out 6 years ago, Tom Harris cried. It wasn't a loud, dramatic breakdown. It was silent, heavy, and completely devoid of hope. The grocery store interview lasted 15 minutes. The store manager, a kid 10 years younger than Tom with a clipboard and a severe haircut, looked at Tom's resume with deep suspicion. "You were a senior analyst at a multi-billion-dollar firm," the manager drawled. "Why do you want to manage the graveyard shift in produce?" "Because I have a kid and a mortgage," Tom said flatly. The manager set the resume down. "You're overqualified. You'll leave the second something better comes along. I need someone who's going to stay." Tom didn't argue. He knew the look. He thanked the kid, walked out into the harsh fluorescent light of the aisles, and bought a box of macaroni and cheese with the last $4 in his checking account. When he got back to his apartment building, Mrs. Higgins was waiting in the lobby. She looked agitated, wringing her hands. "Tom," she said quickly as he pushed through the glass doors. "I'm sorry. I tried to tell her you weren't home, but she insisted on waiting. Tom frowned. Who? The woman from before. The boss. Tom's blood ran cold. He bypassed the elevator and took the stairs 2 at a time. He burst onto his floor, out of breath. Valerie was standing in the narrow, dingy hallway outside his apartment door. She wasn't wearing a designer suit. She was wearing a faded trench coat over a simple black sweater and jeans. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week. There were dark, heavy bags under her eyes, and her posture was stripped of all its usual terrifying command. Tom stopped at the top of the stairs, clutching the plastic grocery bag. They stared at each other for a long moment. The silence was thick, loaded with unspoken accusations and unhealed wounds. "You shouldn't be here," Tom finally said, his voice rough. "I know," Valerie replied. Her voice was quiet, deflated. "Can we go inside, please?" Tom looked at her. He wanted to scream at her. He wanted to tell her exactly what her little moral awakening had cost him. But looking at her now, she didn't look like the CEO who had destroyed his life. She looked like the freezing woman in the alley. He walked past her, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. "Kio's at school," he said curtly. "You have 5 minutes." Valerie stepped inside. She didn't sit down. She stood in the center of the living room, looking at the faded rug, the cheap television, the pile of final notice bills stacked on the kitchen counter. She saw the box of mac and cheese poking out of the grocery bag Tom set down. She closed her eyes. A slow, shuddering breath escaped her lips. "They won," Tom said, crossing his arms. "I saw the news. Richard got the votes. You're out." Valerie opened her eyes. "No, he didn't." Tom frowned. "The financial channels said the vote was a lock." "It was," Valerie said, stepping forward. "Richard had the board. He had the institutional investors. They were going to strip me of the CEO title this morning at 9:00 a.m. "So, what happened?" "I burned the ships," Valerie said simply. Tom stared at her. "What does that mean?" Valerie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She set it on the coffee table. "I spent the last 2 weeks digging," Valerie said, her voice gaining a fraction of its old steel. "Not into the finances. I know the finances. I dug into the internal communications, the safety reports you showed me, the cost-cutting measures the board forced through over the last 5 years. I found the emails. I found Richard explicitly ordering the suppression of injury reports in the Detroit Fulfillment Center and 3 others to artificially inflate the stock price before his own scheduled stock sell-offs. Tom felt the air leave the room. "That's insider trading. That's federal fraud." "Yes," Valerie nodded. "It is." "If you took that to the SEC," Tom started, his mind racing through the implications. "The stock will plummet. The company will be investigated. It will cost Croft Enterprises billions." "I know," Valerie said. "I dropped the files on the desk of the regional director of the SEC at 8 a.m. this morning. I sent copies to the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. By noon today, Richard and 3 other board members are going to be federally indicted." Tom was speechless. He looked at the woman standing in his living room. She had detonated a nuclear bomb inside her own empire. "You destroyed your own company," Tom whispered. "I destroyed a machine that was feeding on people," Valerie corrected him. "The company will survive. The stock will tank, yes, but I filed an emergency motion to transition Croft Enterprises into an employee-owned trust. To stabilize the transition, I liquidated my personal equity." Tom took a step back. "You what?" "My shares," Valerie said. "My trust fund, my father's estate. I signed it all over to the trust. It's the only way to back the company's valuation during the federal investigation, so the workers don't lose their pensions or their jobs." Tom's mind couldn't process the math. Valerie, that's $3 billion. Give or take, she smiled. It was a sad, exhausted smile, but it was entirely genuine. I kept enough to pay off a mortgage and live comfortably. But the private jets, the Mercer Island estate, the political leverage, it's gone. The board is gutted. The employees own the controlling stake now. Tom looked at the paper on the coffee table. He walked over and picked it up. It wasn't a termination letter. It was a deed. What is this? Tom asked. It's a commercial lease, Valerie said, for a small warehouse in Sodo. I bought it yesterday. She walked over to him, standing close enough that he could smell the faint scent of vanilla and rain. Croft Enterprises doesn't need a CEO anymore. It needs a union rep, which they have, Valerie said. But I know supply chain logistics. I know how to move things. I'm starting a new company, a small one, regional, ethical. We pay fair wages, we don't cut corners, and we don't treat people like numbers. She looked up into his eyes. The corporate armor was entirely gone, leaving only the human being underneath. I need a CFO, Valerie said softly. Someone who won't let me build another empire out of ghosts. Someone who will tell me when I'm wrong. Someone who knows what real life looks like. Tom stared at the lease in his hands. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He had spent his whole life playing it safe, keeping his head down, expecting the worst from the people at the top. But this woman had just burned her own kingdom to the ground. To prove that he was right. I clock out at 5, Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. No exceptions. Valerie laughed, a bright, tearful sound that lit up the dingy apartment. I wouldn't have it any other way. 6 months later, the Seattle rain was still falling, but it didn't feel as cold. The warehouse in Sodo smelled of fresh paint, cardboard, and strong coffee. It was a fraction of the size of the Croft Enterprises distribution centers. There were no robotic sorting belts. There were people. People who wore heavy jackets, listened to loud music on portable radios, and knew each other's names. Tom stood in the small glass-walled office overlooking the floor. He was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, holding a clipboard. He looked at the numbers. The margins were tight. They weren't making millions, but the numbers were green, and the employee healthcare plan was the best in the city. The door to the office opened. Valerie walked in. She was carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She was wearing work boots, dark denim, and a Croft Logistics, the new company's name, fleece jacket. The bags under her eyes were gone. She looked alive. Dock 3 is backed up, Valerie said, handing him a mug. The shipment from Portland got delayed by a mudslide. I'll go down and help them reroute, Tom said, taking a sip. It was good coffee, not the cheap stuff. Valerie leaned against his desk, watching him. You don't have to go down there. You're the CFO. You can just adjust the delivery window in the system. Tom smiled, setting the clipboard down. Numbers don't move boxes, Val. People do. Valerie smiled back. It was a private, shared acknowledgement of how far they had come. The billionaire who couldn't look an employee in the eye was gone. In her place was a partner. A loud, chaotic noise erupted from the warehouse floor. Tom and Valerie both looked out the glass. Keo was sprinting down the central aisle, wearing a hard hat that was 3 sizes too big for him, clutching a giant plastic T-Rex. He was being chased by Stan, the former security guard from the corporate tower, whom Tom had personally hired as the new floor manager. Stan was roaring like a monster, letting the 6-year-old outrun him. He's going to trip over a pallet, Valerie said, shaking her head, though her smile never faded. He knows the safety protocols, Tom said proudly. Valerie turned back to Tom. The afternoon light, catching the rain on the window pane, cast a warm glow across her face. Are we okay, Tom? She asked quietly. The numbers, for the quarter. Tom looked down at the ledger on his desk. He thought about the bank account that was no longer empty. He thought about the fact that he hadn't worried about the electric bill in half a year. He thought about the woman standing next to him, who had traded $3 billion for a clear conscience. He closed the ledger. "We're perfect," Tom said. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Valerie looked up at him, her breath hitching slightly. The cynical distance between the employee and the boss had completely collapsed, replaced by something grounded, real, and undeniable. Tom reached out, gently tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Valerie leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a brief second, before opening to meet his gaze. "I'm glad you didn't leave me on the curb," she whispered. "I'm glad you walked through the door," Tom replied. Down on the floor, the T-Rex finally conquered the forklift, and Keo let out a triumphant cheer. Up in the office, Tom and Valerie just watched, standing shoulder to shoulder, finally building a life that actually mattered. Do you believe people can truly change when faced with the harsh reality of the world, or do you think money always wins in the end? Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts on Valerie's ultimate sacrifice. If this story of redemption, hard truths, and real love moved you, please smash that like button, share it with someone who needs a reminder that humanity still exists, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human stories. Turn on those notifications and we'll see you in the next one.